IQ training session provided by Meta Horizon. I'm your instructor Rabindra. So yesterday we discussed about the different identity IQ object models in SailPoint and the essence as well as the relationship between different kind of objects. So yesterday we discussed about application, link and identity relationship. Similarly, we discussed about workflow, task result, identity request, operable set relationship. We also discussed about the provisioning plan related object, and we even defined the objects that are present for certification. So today we're going to describe more about rules and the types of rule that we utilize in SailPoint. So let's begin with the first slide. So actually, if somebody asks you what rule is, so rule is basically a construct, or you can define it as an artifact or object by the utilization of which identity IQ implements the business logic at a specific point. So at a specific point, I mean to say it can be implemented in aggregation process. It can be used in forms and provisioning policy related activities. It can also be used during the time of running connector rules and as well as aggregations and certification. So the main purpose of rule is simply to implement the custom logic in identity IQ, and I will just tell it more once we complete the general category of rules in SailPoint. So in SailPoint there are some categories of rules. There are some connector rules, there are aggregation rule, there are certification rule, and there are form and policy related rules as well. So besides these categories, we also implement rules in various places of SailPoint, or it can be referenced in workflows, it can be utilized in different other objects in SailPoint. So in connector rule we have types like pre-iterate rule, build map rule, post-iterate rule, and in aggregation rule we have resource object customization rule, we have correlation rule, we have identity creation rule, we have manager creation rule. Similarly, in certification we have certification exclusion and certification pre-delegation rules. And whenever we create forms and we develop fields, or if we have any kind of provisioning policy that is related to application onboarding, then in such cases we also implement rules. So the types of rule can be field value rule, allowed values rule, validation, field validation rule, honor rule, etc. So in the next slide, I'm going to describe more about what are the purposes of this connector rule, aggregation rule, certification rule, and form provisioning policy related rules. So let's move on to next slide. So before we jump into writing rules, there are some prerequisites which we have to follow. So in SailPoint Identity IQ, we have logs and context object, which are universally passed as input parameter into SailPoint. So the purpose of log is to record the activities that happens within SailPoint Identity IQ instance. So it can log messages, and it has different labels such as we have log.debug, log.trace, we have log.info, and the log package that is related to implement log into Identity IQ rules is org.apache.log4j.logger, and you can find all the jar files related to logs inside Identity IQ Webin library folder. Similarly, we also have a context object which is packaged into a class called SailPoint.api.SailPointContext. So the purpose of context is to interact with the Identity IQ backend database. Therefore we can define context as a starting point for using the SailPoint API to connect to backend database. So from this context object, the rule that we write can interrogate or can query all the objects and its columns present in the Identity IQ database table. For example, if I want to inquiry about any kind of identity object, then I have to utilize context object. So once I utilize context object, I can use different methods that is present in the package SailPoint.api.SailPointContext in order to gain the attribute values of the identity. Similarly, if I want to find any informations or I want to query any kind of account, then I can use the context object. Similarly, in the same way I can query any object that is present in Identity IQ database through context object. So for any kind of rule, log and context are always available, and it can be utilized to log the information or any kind of errors or any kind of information tracing within rules, so that whenever we have any kind of errors, then we can promptly find those error information from the logs. So generally logs in SailPoint are presented in IIQ console, as well IIQ console or application console, as well as in file. So if you want to divert SailPoint identity IQ logging into a file, then you have to perform logging configuration. So we're going to describe more about logging configuration in the coming classes. Okay, let's move on to next slide. So we can also create custom loggers. So by that I mean we have to create one log object, and by using that log object we can simply put the information in log4j.properties file, so that once we create a custom logger, we have to perform one certain naming convention, and we have to designate the desired logging level as well. So generally whenever you want to create a custom logger, then there are two activities you have to perform. One is adding a custom logger entry into log4j.properties file, and another is once the custom logger is entered into the log4j.properties file, you can use the custom logger object in your rule for coding. So generally if I want to create a custom logger, then this is the naming convention that is provided or suggested by SailPoint. So you have to write a unique name followed by a dot and a rule name, and then you have to set it as a debug label. So for example, it can be log4j.logger, company name can be XYZ Corp, and the rule name can be finance correlation rule, and the label can be set as debug. And once this entry is defined in the log4j.properties file, now I can use the log object, the custom logger, by utilizing these statements. One is you have to import org.apache.log4j.logger object, then you have to create a custom log object with getLogger passed into as the log object or a custom logger you have defined in log4j.properties file. So once this is done, you can utilize the custom log object to utilize different methods that are available to set the label, as well as to print the log label messages. Therefore the log label 2 is the custom logger is set in the log4j.properties file determines which message gets written into the log file. So once this prerequisite is complete, then we can move into connector rule. So whenever we perform aggregation, actually there are some rules that runs in background. So one among the two rule is the connector rule, and we are followed by aggregation rule during the aggregation process. So whenever we initiate an aggregation, always connector rules have the precedence over aggregation rule. So that means connector rules run first before aggregation rules. So generally the purpose of connector rule is to implement pre-processing of data or data by that. So this data actually represent the account or employee informations. You can also implement post-processing of data, and besides that you can manipulate, you can merge or otherwise transform the incoming data as it is being read. So if you want to add some attributes related to the object you are reading on the fly, then you can utilize the connector rule for that purpose. So basically we have two distinction between pre-iterate and post-iterate rule. So these rule always runs once and have a minimal impact on the performance, but other connector rules such as build map rule, it runs for every resource object or the data that is being read from the application. Therefore these kind of rules are very time consuming and time intensive. Therefore choice must be done, like what kind of logic need to be fit into the rules we write under the connector rules category. So the other important rules under connector is pre-iterate and post-iterate rule. Therefore generally a pre-iterate rule applies to a delimited and rule-based file parser connectors. Therefore it can be used to execute any kind of pre-processing. It can be like unzipping of a folder or a file. We can perform even a move operation or copy files or validate files between the servers. So anything that needs to happen prior to iterating or aggregating to the records in the file. So in such case we have to run pre-iterate rule. Therefore pre-iterate rule often works in conjunction with post-iterate rules, and sometimes action performed in the pre-iterate rule are concluded or cleaned up by the post-iterate rule. Thus, post-iterate rule is used to record the information like cleaning up files or marking statistics in a configuration object that it will access and acted upon by the pre-iterate rule. Therefore, for pre-iterate and post-iterate rule, the input argument can be the application schema and stats, and the output argument. So generally, pre-iterate and post-iterate do not generate any kind of return object. Usually, the rules logic generally performs object updates to the object outside of the aggregation data flow. So such kind of object can be configuration object. So the other important rule under connector rule category is a build map rule. So the purpose of build map rule applies to the delimited rule, and therefore whenever the aggregation is initiated, and this build map rule is applied for each employee record as it is being read from a connector. So its main purpose is to read the account information, and it creates a map out of the incoming data. Let's say if we have the column names in a delimited file as name, ID, and phone, and the corresponding record is zoned for name, 1A3D3 as an ID, and phone number 555 as phone, then the result of build map rule is a map of key value pairs. So in our case, the keys are the column names and the values are the records. So if we don't define a build map, if we don't define a method, then build map rule uses a delimited file connector dot default build map column records method to perform default behavior to generate build map, to create or build maps, as well as this build map rule must also import a class, that is SailPoint.connector.delimited file connector. Therefore, the input arguments for build map rule is a records, columns, application, schema, state, and the output argument is a map. So the other important rule is a transformation rule. So the purpose of transformation rule is that it converts the map created by build map rule into a resource object from a delimited file or ZDBC application. So the main purpose of connector rule category is to create a resource object, and this resource object will act as an input to the aggregation rules. So if no transformation rule is specified, then the transformation is performed through a default transform object method in abstract connector class. Therefore, it just like build map rule, it also utilizes a convenience method, that is abstract connector dot default transform object with the parameters schema and object. Therefore, SailPoint.connector.abstract connector class must be imported into the rule to use this method. So the arguments for transformation rule is application schema object, and output argument is resource object, which represents a resource object that is constructed from the incoming map provided by the build map rule. So an instance where transformation rule can be important could be like when loading AD data from delimited file. So this file can examine member of attribute for admin group membership, and it can add isAdmin attribute to the resource object where applicable. So this kind of customization or requirement can be fulfilled through transformation rule. Let's move on to the aggregation rule. So as we have covered up the connector rules, which creates resource objects. So resource object is always an input for the aggregation rule. So aggregation rules are run as a part of aggregation process, which occurs after connector has created, or let's say connector rules has created resource object that represents account or groups that is being aggregated from the target application or source. And besides that, we can also define a refresh rule which runs at the end of account aggregation. The purpose of refresh rule is to update the attributes or any changes that is made into an identity. So those changes could be source mapping of attributes, source mapping of identity attributes, and there are different kind of rule that is associated with aggregation rule. But before we go and deep dive into that, we can just simply define what is the purpose of aggregation rule. So first and foremost, we know that aggregation rule has resource object as an input, and this resource object represents a counter group, right? And we know that the connector rule actually creates the resource object. So once we have the resource object, then we can apply aggregation rule during the time of aggregations, right? So the purpose of aggregation rule is to modify resource object provided by the connector before they are correlated and aggregated. And we can also correlate the resource object to the existing identities. We can even correlate manager identities. We can even customize the creation of manage entitlement during aggregation refresh, and we can even customize an identity before storing it, or at the end of aggregation, or during identity refresh. And we can even customize account group attributes before storing them. So some applications of aggregation rules can be like setting up default password, emails, and it can also include the customization of resource object. Let's say if you just want to manipulate some attributes of identities, then you can perform such kind of customization on resource object as well. And the other important rule is the correlation rule. So the basic purpose of correlation is to combine multiple identities into an identity that is created from authoritative application. Let's say if authoritative application also has my account, and my account is also created in a non-authoritative application. So during the aggregation of authoritative and non-authoritative application, two identities will be created, right? So if we have multiple identities for the same person, then that's the bad practice of managing identities. So as per SailPoint, what it does is that it utilizes the correlation configuration, correlation rules, or manual correlation, so that we'll have one identity, and that identity will hold the accounts, which are actually the links for authoritative application as well as non-authoritative application. So that means once correlation rule is applied, if I am the user, my identity will be created during the authoritative application, and during the non-authoritative application integration, the account that is read will be attached to one identity. Therefore, under one identity, I'll have account information of two different applications, and that is the purpose of correlation. So we can perform correlation by implementing correlation rule or correlation configuration, also called correlation attribute match, or by manual correlation. But correlation rule always precedes or supersedes correlation attribute match or correlation configuration. Just like the bill map rule, the correlation rule also runs for every link or account that is created during the aggregation. If the correlation rule returns null, or if the information returned from correlation rule doesn't match to any identity, then in that case a new identity will be created and the account will be correlated or encapsulated to that identity. Therefore, for correlation rule, we have different input arguments and output arguments. So it can be, the input argument are generally application, environment, account, and link, and the output argument is actually a map, and that map identifies or identify, or it may contain any of the key value pair. So it can be an identity name as a key and the corresponding value. It can be an identity or the corresponding identity object, or it can be an identity attribute name and corresponding attribute name. So in this way, correlation rule is applied, and the accounts are correlated to an identity created from the authoritative application. So let's move on to identity creation rule. So identity creation rule are mostly specified for authoritative applications only. So if the correlation rule cannot find an identity that corresponds to an account, so one must be created. So this is where identity creation rule is used. So besides that, it can also be used to set a default identity IQ password, or it can also be a default email for that identity. Therefore, for this, the input arguments are application, environment, account, identity, and the output is none. So an example can be identity creation rule concatenates a first name and last name field from an account to create an identity name in the format first name dot last name. And once the user identity object or identity name is created, we can assign an identity IQ capability based on the accounts group membership. And once that is done, we can also set a default password for that identity, and the identity parameter is directly modified by the rule. So in such scenarios, we can implement identity creation rule. So let's say in identity creation rule, if you want to set any kind of default values, default capabilities, or default kind of scopes, then you can utilize identity creation rule. So the other one is manager correlation rule. So in manager correlation rule, the purpose is to identify identities manager based on the application account, that is being aggregated or refreshed. Therefore, there is one option in the aggregation or refresh task that is called promote attributes. So therefore, this promote attribute option must be checked on whenever we perform any aggregation or refresh task so as to implement the manager correlation rule. And similarly, the always refresh manager option forces manager refresh to occur whenever the source links attribute value hasn't changed. Alternatively, the no manager correlation option bypasses all the manager correlation regardless of whether the source attribute has changed or not. So these are the three important check boxes that needs to be set to true or false depending upon the company's requirements, so that you can trigger manager correlation rule or stop the manager correlation rule to execute. Therefore, the input arguments for manager correlation rule is application, environment, instance, connector, link, and manage attribute value, and the output is a map that identifies the manager's identity. Besides aggregation and connector rules, the implementation of rule also comes into certification. So certification is generally a collection of access reviews. So in that case, whenever we want to execute a certification items are generated. So if we want to, let's say, omit, or if you want to exclude some of the certification certification items related to certification entity, then we can perform or execute certification exclusion rule. Therefore, we know that the certification entity depends on the type of certification being run, right? And can be a bundle or account group or identity, and certification items are dependent on entity and the certification type. So for example, for identities, the certification item can be roles or entitlement. For groups, it can be permissions or members, and for roles, they can be required roles or permitted roles or entitlements or members or its compositions. Therefore, this rule has to be passed with two lists, that is items and items to exclude. And the input argument for this certification exclusion rule is entity, certification context, items to exclude, state identity, and the output argument is an explanation. Therefore, one implementation of this rule can check for inactive identities or identities identified as contractors and remove all certification item if either check evaluates as true. So in this situation, we can implement certification exclusion rule. So the other one is pre-delegation rule. So just like certification entity rule, the purpose of pre-delegation rule is to divert or determine where the certification entity or certification items has to be pre-delegated. So one example of pre-delegation rule can be, this rule delegates the certification responsibility in a manager certification to each employee who reports to that manager. So each employee first evaluates and certifies their own access, then their decisions are returned to the manager for review and approval or modification. So in such scenario, we can perform or implement certification pre-delegation rule. So the other important implementation of rule is during the creation of forms and provisioning policies. So generally, these rules are set to check on various fields, options on forms, such as workflow or reporting as well, or we can even utilize provisioning policy template. Therefore, these rule types that relate to these objects are allowed value rule, field value rule, validation rule, and honor rule. So the purpose of allowed value rule is that in a form we can define different fields. So this rule actually determines the values to be displayed in a drop-down list of boxes on workflow forms or provisioning policies or report form. So we can implement field value rule as well. So this rule is used to determine the field value on provisioning policy templates. The calculated value of the field is used instead of presenting the field to a user for data input, whereas on forms, this populates a default value for the field but doesn't prevent field presentation to a user. The other one is validation rule. So this rule is used for validating the contents of a field as a template or form. For example, if a form field is asking for an email input, and if you are just typing numbers, then in that case we can implement validation rule stating the user that only email with domain names @ are permitted in that field. So if such scenario is required in a form or a provisioning policy, then we can utilize validation rule. So the other is a honor rule. So the honor rule are required to determine which user will be presented a form for data gathering of the required field. So it determines the honor, and that person will be responsible to provide the field values in a form whenever required. So these are the types of rules that we implement in SailPoint on various aspects. So we implemented rule on aggregation process, which are connector rules and aggregation rules. Similarly, we also implemented rules during the time of certification as certification pre-delegation and certification exclusion rule. We also have other flavors related to certification rules such as sign-off approval rules. So these rules can be described more when we discuss on certification more in the coming classes. So by this time, I hope you have understood the importance of rules, the types of rules, and where the rules are referenced and used or are to be created. So I hope that until this time you have understood